Good evening, everyone. I'm Steve Barnes. Welcome to Debate Week here on the Arkansas Educational Television Network, AETN. First up tonight, the race for Congress in Arkansas's 3rd Congressional District. The candidates in alphabetical order: Steve Isaacson of Eureka Springs, a Libertarian Party candidate, and Representative Steve Womack of Rogers, the incumbent and Republican nominee. The candidates will be questioned tonight by a panel of Arkansas journalists: Rusty Turner of the Northwest Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, Una Lee of KHBS KHOG, and Kelly Kissel of the Associated Press. Each candidate will have 2 minutes for an opening statement. Each will have 2 minutes to respond to a question, while rebuttals are limited to 1 minute. And at the conclusion of tonight's appearance, each candidate will have 2 minutes for an opening statement, or rather a closing statement. Now, the order of opening statements, questioning, rebuttals, and closing statements was determined prior to this broadcast by a coin toss, which the candidates or their representatives participated. Our timekeeper tonight is Carla Hayes of AETN, and with that, our first opening statement tonight, Mr. Isaacson.
Thank you very much. I want to thank everybody for inviting me here, and I want to thank AETN for having me and hosting this debate. My name is Steve Isaacson, and of course I'm running on the Libertarian Party here for the 3rd District of Arkansas. I decided to run because, as being a veteran, a disabled veteran, 100% disabled veteran, I had a lot of veterans in the 3rd District come to me and complaining that they weren't being taken care of. And they wanted me to run to office to get something done for this. I became a veterans advocate because I fought the VA for 23 plus years to get what was coming to me, what was owed to me, like every veteran out there. So for quite a few years I've been a veterans advocate, not just for veterans in the 3rd District or in the state of Arkansas, but I've been a veterans advocate for all veterans across this nation. Veterans come first, and that's my big issue.
Mr. Isaacson, thank you. Mr. Womack, 2 minutes, sir.
Once again, I want to thank AETN and the panelists here today for inviting us and for hosting this very important discussion about the issues that are facing our country today and the run-up to the election on November the 8th. As I said many years ago when I sought this office the first time, that I thought that my background and experience as a small businessman, as a member of our military and veteran, and now as somebody who has served in the halls of Congress, uniquely qualifies me to represent the people of the 3rd District of Arkansas, arguably one of America's premier, more dynamic districts in the entire country. As I said, I was a small businessman, a broadcaster, local radio station operator for a number of years, spent 30 years in uniform, served in a number of command and staff positions throughout those 30 years, retiring in 2009 at the rank of colonel, having commanded at the battalion and regimental level. And then going to Congress following 12 years as a mayor of Arkansas's 9th largest city, the city of Rogers, Arkansas, and now having spent 6 years in Congress where I have served on the Appropriations Committee, the only committee in Congress that has actually done any expense cutting in Washington, having trimmed our discretionary budget to now to just over $1 trillion a year. And I'm looking forward to going back to Congress in the 114th Congress and continuing to make a difference in Washington, where we have a number of issues that are facing the Congress and the newly elected president in November when sworn in January. So I'm looking forward to the opportunity to having this discussion today and the opportunity to take head on the issues facing our country as we move into the next few years. Thank you very much.
Mr. Womack, thank you very much. It's Mr. Womack who takes the first question tonight, Rusty Turner.
Congressman, you've spoken many times about your support for legislation that would allow states and local governments to collect sales tax on internet sales. Could you please explain that position, why you think that's important, and where that stands?
Yeah, great question. And let me just say this. What is known as marketplace fairness, or the current version of the legislation, Remote Transaction Parity Act, stems from a constitutional discussion that took place in 1992 and eventually a decision by the Supreme Court that said that states do not have the authority to compel out-of-state retailers to collect and remit the taxes on a retail purchase outside the state boundaries if that particular retailer does not have a nexus, a presence in the state. So when somebody in Arkansas goes to the store in Arkansas and buys an item, the taxes, the sales taxes on that item are collected and remitted back to the state by that retailer. But you can go online to an out-of-state vendor and buy that same item or items, and that out-of-state vendor does not have to collect and remit back to the state those taxes. Look, it's not my mission in life to try to raise taxes on anybody, but what I do believe should happen is that the playing field should be level for everyone, that it is an unfair advantage for out-of-state retailers that do nothing for our state to be able to engage in commerce in our state without having to do what the local retailers have to do. So my purpose in this is to level the playing field for the local merchants. Somebody has to be speaking for the retail backbone of our community, which happens to be those merchants that line Main Street. And the taxes that are collected by these merchants are lawfully due and payable, whether they're bought in our state or outside our state. So just leveling the playing field, I think, is the appropriate thing to do. And I'm about free markets without government intervention into dictating through tax policy who has an advantage and who's disadvantaged. And that's the reason for the bill.
Mr. Womack, thank you. Mr. Isaacson, 2 minutes.
Okay, Mr. Womack talks about the internet tax. I have talked to a lot of constituents within the 3rd District or even here in Arkansas about this. Number one, as Mr. Womack has talked about cutting taxes, now he wants to add an internet tax. My question is, where's the cut? How can you cut one thing and add to it? You know, there's no cut. You do the math. It's that simple. People are tired of paying taxes. Taxes, tax is nothing but theft anyway. That's my opinion.
Mr. Womack, 1 minute rebuttal.
Well, what my opponent probably doesn't know or is failing to admit is that since 1949, Arkansas has had a use tax, and that if you buy something out of state, it's not that it's tax-free. That's not a duty-free marketplace. The fact is that you are required to pay those taxes back to the taxing subdivision, in this case, the state of Arkansas. What's happening is people recognize now that they can go online, and before then it was catalog sales, but they can go online and they can buy items that they can readily buy in our state through local merchants and essentially make those purchases and not have to pay the taxes that are due and payable back to the state of Arkansas because there's no real enforcement mechanism. And that gives an unfair advantage to the out-of-state retailer. And then let's not forget the fact that these taxes go to support vital services for everyday Arkansans. This is how we pay for county government. It's how we run ambulances. It's how we provide law enforcement. And in many cases, they're indirectly tied to schools because when businesses go out of business that pay ad valorem taxes, those taxes don't get collected by our political subdivisions. Again, I will say this is not a tax increase proposal. This is simply a method by which we level the playing field for all merchants, regardless of where those purchases are made.
Thank you. So the next question goes first to Mr. Isaacson. Ms. Lee.
Mr. Isaacson, Donald Trump has made controversial comments about women in 2005. The audio was just released on Friday. Both you and Mr. Womack have voiced support from Donald Trump. In the past 72 hours, have you changed your mind?
In the last 72 hours, I don't condone what he did 11 years ago. That was 11 years ago. And I have not changed my mind. I do still support Donald Trump because the man talks from the heart. He means what he says. That's something that we need in this country. I know I'm running on a libertarian ticket, and let me explain. Yes, I'm running on a libertarian ticket, but I have the right, constitutional right, to vote for whoever I feel is going to do a better job. I still support Donald Trump, and I will support him, even being in Congress or out of Congress, because he'll get the job done. We can work with him and get things done that needs to be done. Simple as that.
Mr. Isaac, thank you. Mr. Womack.
Well, there's no question what the comments that were uncovered by the video that was released that was 11 years of age that happened in 2005 were disgusting, insulting, and really indefensible from a human being's point of view. And you know, while and I don't condone that kind of behavior. But as I've said many times during the course of this campaign, and I will say again here tonight for the people witnessing this discussion, America is at a very distinct crossroads right now. And I would like to see this election decided as a contest of ideas and less of a contest about the personalities involved. And it's very difficult to get up above that level and to see where America is headed. And it is my strong belief that the ideas and the values and the issues espoused by the people of my party, the Republican Party, are the ideas that will best push America into a direction where we can salvage the greatest country the world has ever known for future generations. So with that, my support is still with the nominee of our party. And it will be that way until such time that we have other alternatives. But those other alternatives aren't there presently. So I am still in support of the candidate that has been nominated by our party because I believe it is our ideas that will reshape the future of America and save her for future generations.
Mr. Isaacson, 1 minute, sir.
A lot of what Mr. Womack says, I do agree about supporting your own party. But if you go through, let's say, me being a libertarian, yes, that's just a name. I have a saying, and I hope you can bleep this out if you want. But I was raised as a Democrat in the state of Illinois. I became a Republican, and then I was duped by the Republicans in the state of Arkansas. But I have come to the conclusion, when I go to vote on the ticket, no matter what it is, who's on that ticket, I vote for the person. I don't vote for a jackass, and I don't vote for an elephant. That's simple.
All right, next question comes from Kelly Kissel. Goes first to Mr. Womack.
Congressman, it's a multi-part question, so bear with me, please. Is it proper to say that John McCain is not a war hero? Is it proper to mock people with a congenital joint condition? Is it proper to criticize a Miss Universe winner for gaining weight? And if the answer to all of those questions is no, and yet you still want to support your candidate, would it be reasonable for voters to consider another candidate at the top of the ticket and then go for a GOP-controlled Congress to check him or her at their every move?
Well, Kelly, thank you for the question. In anyone's book, to mock a disabled person, to comment about the weight of a young lady that has won a crown, or any lady for that matter, and to describe a war hero like John McCain as being less than a war hero would be wrong in anybody's book. It is not the form of decency that I think that rises to the qualification to become the President of the United States. So, as I said, in anybody's book, that's not decent commentary on anyone's part. The second part of your question, though, has to do with should another candidate be considered. At least that's what I'm hearing. And at this stage of the game, there are no other alternatives. We have gone through a primary process that has spanned several months. It has yielded a result. The result being that Donald Trump, the person who has made those comments, happens to be the nominee of our party. And while I'm pretty confident that I speak for the party as a whole, that nobody condones that kind of discussion or that kind of rhetoric, that he is still in fact the nominee of our party. And as I said in my comment a moment ago, this is about ideas. This is about who has the best capacity and the best ideas to move America in the proper direction. America is at a crossroads. We have the Supreme Court bias in balance. We have a tax code that needs to be rewritten. We have a regulatory burden on small and medium and large-sized businesses. And we've got Obamacare and a horde of other regulations that need to be dealt with. And I believe that Mr. Trump is best positioned to push us in that direction because he is the nominee of our party.
Mr. Isaacson, 2 minutes, sir.
Once again, as Mr. Womack has said, a lot he says, I have to agree. It's, that's just facts. I will not disagree with someone that I believe is on the right track of what he or she says. Because we have a right in this country to agree or disagree. And that's what's so great about this country. But one thing I don't agree with, and I'd like to get into the subject, is our veterans in this nation today. Our VA is broken, has been broken. I've dealt with it. I fought for them for 23 plus years to get what I have coming because they said my accident never happened. We have homeless veterans, especially here in Arkansas. We have veterans that are being denied at the VA hospital because, and I quote, "You weren't in combat." I quote, "You make too much money." That's not the way it was written in the beginning. The VA is supposed to take care of every veteran that serves this country. And that's an issue we need to deal with here in Arkansas, in the 3rd District, and across this country. I'm adamant about it, and we need to talk about it because other than Mr. Womack being a 30-year veteran, he has not helped a veteran in the 3rd District whatsoever. I have record that he has denied a veteran that asked for help and turned him over to the DC police. I have that record.
Mr. Womack, you have 1 minute, sir.
Wow, I've never helped a veteran. That'll be a surprise to a lot of people that have called my office with veterans-related issues where a very competent and a very compassionate staff has worked very hard to help veterans in the 3rd District of Arkansas navigate the complicated VA process and actually get what was coming to them. Look, veterans' issues are very difficult, particularly when you're dealing with a bureaucracy as large and as burdensome as the Veterans Administration happens to be. And I have stood behind our veterans, and I have been sponsors and a sponsor and co-sponsor of legislation that is designed to break down that bureaucracy, hold the bureaucracy accountable, and do a better job of dealing with the veterans. I have supported legislation that has put more money into those programs so that money can't be the reason why we are denying our veterans the care that they have earned and the care that America promised and should be delivering. So to make a categoric comment that a person like me who has spent 30 years in uniform and spends a tremendous amount of time, both personally and through the staff work of the 3rd District of Arkansas, not paying attention to the issues surrounding our veterans would just simply be an inaccurate statement, and I reject it out of hand. So I think my record speaks for itself on veterans issues.
Mr. Isaacson takes the next question first. Rusty Turner.
Mr. Isaacson, for the viewers at home who may not be familiar with the Libertarian Party, could you describe the key differences between Libertarians and Democrats and Republicans?
Okay, the Libertarian Party there's a lot of things that they believe in as a party. For one, and quote me if I'm wrong, but they are not pro-life. But they tell us that we can be whatever we need to be, what we feel. So that's why I'm pro-life. I'm running on a Libertarian Party, but I'm pro-life, and they accept that. Okay, they want smaller government. I want smaller government. I think everybody wants smaller government. We need to get the federal government out of our pockets, out of our backyards, and out of our bedroom. Let the states take care of it. That's basically what the Libertarian Party believes in my mind.
Mr. Womack, you have 2 minutes.
Well, I don't think it's my role to necessarily try to articulate what the Libertarian Party is about. I don't spend a lot of time worrying about what the Libertarian Party is doing, and has already been disclosed here tonight in this debate. The candidate who happens to occupy a spot on the ballot under the Libertarian banner is not even going to support the Libertarian candidate for president. So I'll let the Libertarians fuss over that. I'm more concerned about what we're doing as Republicans, the conservative voice in Washington, D.C. And what I have done as a member of Congress, as I said in my opening, serving on the Appropriations Committee, we've gone directly to the spending, the discretionary spending, that which Congress has the ability to affect right now. I've used my position as an appropriator to ensure that the money that is going out for the discretionary programs that fund most of the government as we know it today is spent wisely, that it's accountable and it is responsible in addressing the emerging needs of our country. I'm more concerned about how Republicans feel about many of the issues that shape the economy, our tax policy, the regulatory environment that we operate in, what we're doing for our small businesses to allow them to grow and develop, to give birth to ideas and to expand and to put people to work. I'm concerned about what we're doing with the welfare system, how we're training people not to work instead of getting able-bodied people who are on government assistance out there and genuinely looking for work and doing the things necessary to pull themselves out of poverty and make them productive citizens. I'm concerned about the assault on the freedoms of our country, the insatiable appetite of this administration and the liberal people in our country who want to take away rights like our ability to possess arms. So these are the things that I'm concerned about as a Republican and as a member of the Conservative Party that's trying to put our country on a different glide path.
Mr. Isaacson, you have 1 minute, sir.
One word I have to say, really? Mr. Womack, I have to say, number one, you haven't really done anything for the taxes or for the people, because especially when you say a veteran, my question is, why do veterans come to me? My phone rings off the hook because they can't get anything out of your office. Okay, as that being said, you're not doing anything about cutting taxes. You're not helping the small business, the small mom and pops, because I talk to them all the time. And a lot of them, you come to Eureka Springs, which you never do unless you talk to the bigwigs there. The businesses are going out of business. There's for sale signs for these small businesses. So you tell me what you're doing for Eureka Springs. Absolutely nothing.
Our next question goes first to Mr. Womack. Ms. Lee.
Mr. Womack, would you support greater U.S. involvement in the Syrian civil war? If so, to what extent?
Absolutely, I would support more involvement in the Syrian war. I mean, look, the Syrian crisis has come to Arkansas, and it's primarily because we have had a void in leadership. I mean, we drew red lines in Syria, and we told the president there, Bashar al-Assad, that if you use chemical weapons against your people, there will be consequences for that, and they're used and there are no consequences. So look, Syria is a mess. My heart breaks for Syria. The fact that there is a major exodus of millions of people from their homeland, displaced because of a lack of leadership on the part of the United States. Syria is a mess, and it's not getting any better. So I think that American leadership is going to have to be utilized in some form. And look, I'm not here to decide whether or not, or to cast some kind of opinion over whether or not all options should be on the table, but when you're dealing with something as serious as the unrest between areas from Iraq to Syria, up into Turkey, on up into Europe, when you're dealing with these large-scale issues that are displacing millions of people and causing untold damage and the loss, the catastrophic loss of life as a result of it, you can come back and point to a void of leadership from the rational thinkers in this world, that being the United States of America and our capacity to build coalition support to be able to deal with it. So should we have provided safe zones for the people of Syria to be able to remain in their homeland? Of course we should have. Should we have performed other strategic and tactical operations in that region to be able to help rid that country of the weak leadership that has put them in the position that they're in today? Of course we should have. But the fact is, America is sitting on its hands right now while that region of the country, a very important region of the world, continues to burn.
Mr. Isaacson, 2 minutes, sir.
I can take less than 2 minutes on that, and I can say, Mr. Womack, I totally agree with you on the situation with Syria. Every word he said. But one thing I do not agree with that's coming to Arkansas, a organization called Canopy bringing Syrian refugees to Northwest Arkansas. What are you going to do about that? That's a big question.
Mr. Womack, 1 minute.
Well, the refugee crisis is a huge issue for our country. Not just our country, but look, they are leaving Syria, and they're making their way through the paths of least resistance up into Europe, and then finding their way to our homeland. And there's no, while I have a heart for them, the practical side of me says that the safety and security of our country has to come first. And that absent a fail-safe vetting process for people of certain persuasions coming into our country, many of whom will have ill intent for our country, not to come to our country and live the American dream, but to end up in our country to crush the American dream. These are the things that we have to be careful about, and so that's why I believe that we need to have the stop sign out on the refugee resettlement program in this country until we have a process that we can count on that will save us from the potential harm created by people coming to this country with ill intent.
Mr. Isaacson gets the next question. First, Mr. Kissel.
As recently as 2 decades ago, Arkansas had some of the longest serving members of Congress and with it considerable power and respect. Congressman here has mentioned his service on the Appropriations Committee. Do we risk failing to regain power if you're elected?
I don't think so, because I'm running for the people. That's who I am. No one's going to change me. You can call me whatever you want, but I'm running for the people. That's what I'm here for, because that's what they're hired to do. People say they're our leaders. Yes, we have to lead. But at the same time, if you stop and think about it, they are our employees. We hire them, pay them to do the job for us. So I get into Congress, I'll be working for 100% of the constituents, not 56% as Mr. Womack's grade is right now, which is an F, because it's about 100% of the constituents and nothing for the lobbyist.
Mr. Womack, 2 minutes, sir.
Well, look, I would never argue that you should vote for me, because if you don't vote for me, we lose some kind of power in Congress. It is a fact that I am an appropriator. It is a fact that the members of the Appropriations Committee are the people responsible for seeing that the $1 trillion plus in discretionary spending is spent wisely. So I guess if you want to call that powerful, so be it. And who knows what would happen if Mr. Isaacson were to be elected to Congress, what committee he would serve on. But each and every member of Congress has an equal share of the power. My vote's no better, no different than the vote of any other member of the House of Representatives. The reason you should vote for me is because I bring years of experience and know-how and understanding of how things in America work. As a small businessman, as a member of the military, maybe more importantly as a mayor, as somebody who had to wear that hat every day, that did not check political preferences when issues came to me, but instead look to see that a government would function, that it would be accountable for the people that it's representing, that it was delivering the services that are demanded and required of the people that support me. And that's precisely what I do as a member of Congress, just on a much larger scale with a big world out there with which to have to wrestle some of these decisions with. So that's what I bring to the table. And again, to suggest that a member who gets beat in an election is going to, shall we say, water down the effectiveness of that particular office and that particular district and the total congressional picture, I think would be a bit unfair.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Isaacson, 1 minute.
Again, Mr. Womack's voting record is 56%. That is an F, okay? So where is he doing what he says he's doing to help the people here when his voting record is only 56%? I have so many constituents coming to me that are tired of him not listening to what they are asking him to do. It's constant. So when you have a voting record of 56%, in my eyes, which is an F, you need a change. And now is the time to change, because it's all about the people. The Constitution starts. We the people. I'm part of the we.
Next question comes first from Mr. Turner for Mr. Womack.
Congressman, there are 8 states who have approved the use of marijuana either as in medical terms or for recreational use, and Arkansas voters will have the opportunity this fall to make the same choice. If Arkansas chooses to legalize the use of marijuana for medical purposes, would you support any changes in federal law that would clear the way from a federal level?
Look, I have strong feelings about the use of illicit drugs. I have the very idea of illicit drug use has been very personal to me because it's hit my own family. And I believe that the use of marijuana, which we have federal statutes against, I believe it's that illicit use that forms a stepping stone to other drug use, more egregious drug use, and the corresponding ancillary impact that it has on society. I am not going to go to Washington, D.C. Even if Arkansas approves a medical marijuana act, I'm not going to go to Washington, D.C. and start trying to undo federal statutes so that we can make the federal government more in line with what the state of Arkansas believes. That's just not who I am, and it's not what I believe. I respect the fact that Arkansas is going to get an opportunity to vote on it. I respect the fact that there are other states that have gone beyond medical marijuana and have approved ballot initiatives for recreational use of marijuana. I just don't think that's the direction that the state of Arkansas ought to go, and I don't think it's what's right for our people. That's my position, and I've got some very, very hard feelings about it.
Mr. Isaacson.
Okay, I support the medical marijuana, and I quote medical, okay? I don't approve everyday usage for recreational. As a veterans advocate, like I say, I deal with a lot of veterans. I have seen medical cannabis work on veterans with PTSD, veterans that have severe seizures. I have a veteran that we moved from the state of Tennessee, the VA would not help, to Colorado, having severe seizures. They gave him 3 drops because you can put it in a liquid form. It's not all about smoking. They gave him 3 drops. He came out of the seizure. I've seen him rub the oil, the cannabis oil, on a child's feet going in a seizure. Comes out of the seizure. Cannabis is a natural plant. You can look across this nation. There is no federal law stating that it is illegal to grow cannabis. Cannabis is a plant, natural plant. God put it here. I may not use it. I've never used it, but that doesn't mean I can't support it for medical reasons because I've seen it work.
Mr. Isaacson, thank you. Mr. Womack, 1 minute.
Well, if there were a way, and I know we have laws in effect for other illicit drugs that are under the Controlled Substances Act. If there was a fail-safe way of making sure that this is not going to be diverted into the hands and for the use of people who would use it more recreationally, I might feel a little bit differently about it. But there's no question that marijuana is the first step toward more serious illicit drug use that is complicating the lives of many people that I represent, including my own. And so as a result of that, unless and until we have a system, a fail-safe system to ensure that like other narcotics that are controlled by Controlled Substances Act, I can't offer my support at this time.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Lee has the next question. It goes first to Mr. Isaacson.
Mr. Isaacson, marijuana is a Scheduled I substance under the Controlled Substances Act, meaning it's in the same category as heroin. It's even listed higher by the federal government than cocaine. Should marijuana be classified higher than cocaine?
Absolutely not, because if you look up, where did the word marijuana come from? Does anybody know where the word marijuana came from? Back in the 60s, okay? Where was all they called weed coming from? Coming across the border from Mexico, coming from Tijuana. So someone back there decided to make, because they can't make a natural plant illegal, they renamed it to marijuana. Marijuana, Tijuana. Think about it. So, because it's not a marijuana plant, that's not what it is. It's a cannabis. It's hemp, which we use hemp to make clothes and everything else, which to me is ridiculous that it's not legal to grow it here in the United States, but we can buy it from another country and sell ropes, clothes that's made out of hemp. Same plant. So it's, marijuana is just a word.
Mr. Isaacson, thank you, sir. Mr. Womack, 2 minutes.
Well, the short answer to the question is yes, it should. The reason that we have a Controlled Substances Act to begin with is to ensure that these things do not get into the hands of people that can do exactly what they do, and that is cause people to become addicted, to seek other forms of drug use, and to further complicate the existence of illicit drug use in our society and all of the corresponding cascading impacts of that use. So I'm in support of it. As I said, there are federal statutes regarding the controlled substances that are widely available in this society, and anything that we can do to prevent these drugs from getting into the hands of people, first-time users, to give them a stepping stone to other more dangerous and more complicated illicit drug use, I would support.
Mr. Isaacson, 1 minute, sir.
To go back with the medical cannabis act that's on the ballot, it can be controlled because, number one, the only way they can get it is through a doctor's prescription, and they have to have a card. That is a control. And people don't realize that this weed and marijuana that kept coming across the border, what was hurting the people and them going to other drugs was not the marijuana / hemp. It's what the people tainted it with. Okay? That's what they got addicted to and onto other drugs. But at the same time, we have the VA giving our veterans oxycodone, fentanyl, which is approved through the FDA. They say it's a safe drug. I'm sorry, it's not, because I've had 3 veterans die of each one of them because they were addicted to oxycodone that the VA gave to them. Then the VA took it away from them, cold turkey. Next thing you knew, they committed suicide.
Kelly Kissel, question for first, Mr. Womack.
Congressman, what does comprehensive immigration reform look like to you?
A disaster. Comprehensive anything today means you just throw it all up on the wall and see what sticks. And that's not a thoughtful approach. And we've got some real issues regarding immigration that you just simply can't do with what I call comprehensive reform. So let's begin with step one of the issue. And that is, we have an insecure border between the United States and our neighbors to the south. There's no question what over the last 20, 25, 30 years, we have seen a steady influx of people coming into this country in an undocumented way or coming through with certain types of visas and then overstaying their visa. Visa expires and they don't go back to their country of origin. So we've had a constant infusion of people into our society who either came here illegally or are in the country illegally. Unless you secure the border, no real immigration reform is ever going to work. You can talk about what to do with interior enforcement. You can talk all day and try to come up with solutions to the HB1 visa programs and all the other visa programs associated with trying to get people here for work purposes and what have you. You can have a meaningful discussion about a guest worker program. And you can talk all day long about whether you should have E-Verify or some other mechanism out there to be able to determine actually who's legal and who's not. But you shouldn't be practicing border security in the HR offices of local businesses. This should be done at the border. I support border security first, and then a discussion about each and every component of immigration reform to follow thereafter.
All right, Mr. Isaacson.
I agree with the border. You know, we have to start at the border. But something else that goes on here in Arkansas is when someone applies to be a citizen is a disaster, because I've had a couple of them that were not citizens and want to become citizens. They filled out the applications, they paid the $600 and some odd they charge them, and then they turn around and say, I lost the paperwork, and make them pay it again to go through it again. That part needs to be fixed. But we do need to start at the border. We really do.
Mr. Womack, back to you for 1 minute, sir.
I said what I said. Excuse me. Comprehensive immigration reform is a recipe for putting a lot of things in our immigration structure or immigration law that just simply won't work. You have to secure your border. Step one, border security, and that can be accomplished in a lot of ways, be it a wall, remotely piloted aircraft. We got a lot of drone use going on today that is very efficient and very capable of helping us secure borders. I think it's going to require some boots on the ground. We're going to have more empowered Customs and Border Patrol people and ICE representatives that are operating within the laws of this country. So the things that we have on the books already, if we'll just do those, I think that we have a real good opportunity with border security to solve the biggest component of the problem, and that is the constant influx of people into our country in an undocumented way.
Next question from Mr. Turner goes first to Mr. Isaacson.
Mr. Isaacson, if you're elected, there may come a time that you determine through your study and work as a member of Congress that you support a piece of legislation or a concept that your constituents back home may oppose. If that's the case, how would you vote?
Example, if let's say 70% of my constituents tells me to vote no on something that they've read, majority rules as it says. So I would vote yes or vote no as the constituents say, because one, that's what the constituents want, and that's what I'm supposed to be working for the constituents. But then we have the other 30% on the other side. And my plan would be, everybody would know what I would vote because of whatever the constituents the majority is. But at the same time, I'm not going to leave the 30% left behind. I would sit down, and we will sit down and discuss and come to a happy medium of why I voted no or yes, whatever the 70% wanted me to do. The job of work, being in Congress is to work for your constituents. That's what they elect you for. And that's not being done.
Mr. Womack.
Well, the short answer to the question, Rusty, is about, do you have your finger on the pulse of how the people that you represent actually feel about an issue? And I would argue that if 70% of my district feels a certain way, I'm going to know that pretty well. I mean, it's going to be pretty evident that the overwhelming support for or against an issue that I'm about to vote on is going to be in front of me. And I would argue that my job is to represent the people first. And so therefore, if handed an issue where it was a 70-80% issue, that's a pretty easy decision. You're going to support the overwhelming majority of the constituents that you represent. Sadly, so many of the issues facing our country today you can't categorize in the 70-80% arena. And those are a little harder to kind of judge. So I think the first thing you got to do is get out in your district, see the people, communicate those issues, get the feedback from them through town halls and through coffees and through any opportunity that you can present yourself or you can be in front of the voters that put you there. And then at the end of the day, even then, there are going to be some really, really hard issues that we face where quantifying the percentage being 70 or 80%, or maybe it's 55-45 or 50-50, the people elected me to understand the issue and to do the very best job I can at coming up with solutions that best are directed towards solving for that issue. So when it concerns tax reform or reg relief or immigration or national security, whatever those major issues are out there, the people of the 3rd District of Arkansas have elected me to use my best judgment and use their input to make those decisions that are the best decisions given the case in front of us.
Mr. Womack, thank you. Mr. Isaacson, 1 minute, sir.
Mr. Womack, I've seen your town halls. I've seen your town halls when a constituent stands up there and asks you a question about a Pell Grant and you don't answer it and you yell and scream at them. Mr. Womack, I've seen you on your town hall when someone is a Mexican American that is an American citizen and you stand there and tell him that to come into a place like that, he should be wearing something American and nothing around his neck because he's proud of his heritage. I've seen your town halls.
We have reached the moment now in our program tonight for closing statements. Before we do, our thanks once again to our panel. Again, as was determined by the toss of a coin prior to the debate, first closing argument is Mr. Isaacson's. Sir.
The reason I came here was to tell the people in the 3rd District about putting me into Congress because I'm here to work for the people. I'm not here to work for Washington, D.C., the status quo. I care about the people. I came here this weekend to do this debate, even though that last Wednesday they found my nephew dead, okay? Because I care about everybody. I care about my family. I care about the constituents. This is an obligation that I was asked to do. I am a veteran. I'm a fighter. I will never stop fighting for any constituent, no matter what side of the party you're on. If you have a problem, you come to me, we will solve it. That's simple. Not a bunch of Washington rhetoric.
Mr. Isaacson, thank you. Congressman Womack, you have 2 minutes, sir.
Once again, I want to thank AETN for hosting this debate, a general discussion about the issues facing our country and who the people of the 3rd District of Arkansas feel can best represent their ideas and their hopes and their dreams in the halls of Congress. Look, I was elected mayor of Rogers in 1998, left the private sector, having spent a number of years running a small business, and was called to public service to basically champion ideas that serve the needs of the people that elected me. And I did that, I think, pretty successfully for 12 years. In 1998, the people of Rogers gave me an unbelievable opportunity to show what I can do to help chart a course for the community of Rogers, Arkansas. And I think by anybody's yardstick, the things that we were able to do there were very successful. In 2010, given the same opportunity now to take those same ideas, that same work ethic, and that same desire to serve the people to Washington, D.C. And for 6 years, I've done that. I've been there every day. And as we tape this proceeding, I've never missed a vote on the floor of the House. I've got a qualified and competent staff in Rogers, in Fort Smith, and in Harrison, whose job it is to make sure they're available to take on the issues that are brought to us by the constituents we represent and help solve those problems, whether they're with the IRS or the Social Security Administration or the VA. And my team does a remarkable job in answering the constituent service needs of our country. We're just beginning. America is at a big crossroads. I'd love the opportunity, and I'm asking for your vote, to give me the opportunity to go back into the 115th Congress and continue to make a difference for the 3rd District of Arkansas and its people. Thank you very much.
Mr. Womack, we thank you. We thank Mr. Isaacson once again, both you gentlemen, for participating in tonight's debate. Once again, tip of the hat to our panel for coming in. And that wraps it up for the 3rd Congressional District debate for this season. Stay with us. We'll be back in just a few minutes with the candidates in Arkansas's 4th Congressional District.
Major funding for Election 2016 AETN debates is provided by AARP Arkansas.